osprey here. There's one sitting on a tree. There's 1, 2, 3 osprey in the air. All of them fishing. One of them just dove in the water up here in this pond. So within 100 yards, we've got 8 osprey here, all feeding right here on the marsh. Now there's a white egret sitting right below that other osprey.
Like so many of the citizens in this area, I thoroughly enjoy this magnificent little oasis, which we call Dyke Marsh. But over the passage of the time and the erosion, this marsh is now basically only half what it once was.
This is the last remaining marsh of its sort in the greater Washington area on the Potomac River. And this sort of marsh has been greatly disappearing, especially in the eastern United States in recent years.
As a member of the Environment Committee in the United States Senate for many years, I'm proud to work with the National Park Service, who are actively taking an interest, as they have for a half century, in Dyke Marsh, to help bring it back to its full grandeur a half century ago.
They're one of those places along the river where you feel as if you're stepping back into a time when the Potomac was inhabited by Piscataway Indians and all of their relatives.
You can't say that it's a pristine marsh. It's not. It's been affected by too many works of man, but it's hanging in there. This marsh was due to the silt that came down from Hunting Creek
and begin to be deposited in one area, and over a long period of time cause a rise in the elevation in which plants become established and a marsh slowly forms.
From what we know about the history of Dyke Marsh, earlier on it was inhabited by Indian tribes, but around the turn of the century and on into the 1900s, it became farmland, and that's the reason why dikes were put up. And that's where the word Dyke Marsh came from originally.
Way back in the 1930s when they were talking about building this parkway, the original plan was to keep the marshes, I think they said for generations to enjoy, and to have it as a bird sanctuary and a biological laboratory. When they were building the Mount Vernon Parkway down to Mount Vernon, that they also talked about saving the views, the visual splendor of this stretch of river, yes, which is always under attack.
And then there was a time that the marsh was used, unfortunately, by a sand and gravel company to remove that material from the marsh to sell.
I remember when there were lines of barges out here waiting to get filled, and a man on a bulldozer on the shore here. That was not a happy prospect. I used to lie in bed at night and I could hear the dredges working, clanking away, eating up the marsh. Really, they took about half of the marsh. Right.
There are some big holes in the marsh now, deep holes, roughly 20 feet or so, that are the remains of the digging by the companies in those days.
There was a lot of lobbying that went on. That naturalist, Erskine Barnes, wrote a column in the Washington Post which really focused attention on the problem. Were they going to save it or were they going to get rid of it? And then they got the congressional people behind them, and in 1959, by God, they saved it.
If you look at this map, it's pretty obvious from 1951, that is, the boundary of the marsh, and how it is today, how it's shrunk. And a part of it is the fact that they took sand and gravel out of. There's some deep holes in here and deep holes in there, and perhaps down in that area too. This was a dumping ground after they dredged, a dumping ground for all sorts of debris. Yes. The whole road that we're about to come upon now is something that was largely a dump for old building materials and other things from the Washington, D.C. area.
The haul road is so named because this is where they hauled all the dump trucks in to dump off all the stuff. And you can see what's in here, big hunks of cement. There's also rebar, there's brick in here, and that's essentially what's found underneath the forest here.
Until it was finally stopped in 1972 by a smart bureaucrat who was really an environmentalist.
Marshes of this sort, whether they be entirely freshwater or whether they are salt marshes, these are among the most productive of all the ecosystems that are known in the world.
So I'm very thankful for Friends of Dyke Marsh, the National Park Service, and others who are monitoring environmental quality here. Dyke Marsh Preserve is a gem of biodiversity that you really don't find in much of the rest of the northern part of the state. There are other parks, but they don't have a tidal marsh associated with them. So this is an especially rich place with maybe about 300 or so species of plants, up to maybe 6,000 species of arthropods.
38 species of fish, 16 species of reptiles, 14 species of amphibians, and over 230 species of bird documented from the marsh.
The increased diversity, the more healthy the environment. No one species explodes and takes over at the expense of all other species, and this makes a more stable environment.
If you took just a straight line right out through here, look at all of the different kind of habitats that insects and other invertebrates, and particularly butterflies and birds and mammals, look what they have to choose from. So this is what I'm talking about, the structure of Dyke Marsh.
The fascinating thing about Dyke Marsh is that we believe it's a 5,000-year-old climax cattail marsh, and in remaining a climax vegetation, it has likely has gone through periods of scour, which has knocked the sediment elevations down, and deposition in the mild years where the sediment is able to remain there until it does get scoured again. So there's sort of this dynamic equilibrium that has allowed Dyke Marsh to remain a stable cattail marsh.
The marshes do retain a lot of the sediment that comes off the watershed, and that is good that that is not being transported into the estuary, because that sediment tends to make the water in the estuary turbid, light limiting, and to inhibit many of the processes that go on in the estuary itself, plant production, fisheries, and so on.
In our plants database, we have documented 299 species of plants from Dyke Marsh, again showing the diversity of plant species that occur in the marsh and showing that it really is a healthy ecosystem. Biden's laevis, Iris versicolor, the blue flag, Sagittaria latifolia, the arrowhead, Hornus ammonum, the swamp dogwood, Apios americana. And this is one of the largest tidal freshwater marshes in National Park Service jurisdiction. Fringed loosestrife.
You know, one of the plants that's mostly lacking from Dyke Marsh, there's some of it, but mostly lacking, is wild rice. And wild rice used to be very common in these marshes. Now why it's gone or down, I don't know. But wild rice is a wonderful habitat for waterfowl.
This is called a riparian forest because of its dependency on water. That whole forest is only here because the cattail marsh protects it. It's the buffer between the erosion from the river and the forest. If the marsh cattails go, well then the high tides will start eroding and knocking over these big trees, and we'll have right up to the houses no barrier along the Potomac River. One of the most important parts of Dyke Marsh is the constant canopy of the large trees in this riparian forest. They offer a refuge for the animals that move from tree to tree. And this is the end of the constant canopy. If you run from southern Virginia all the way up Potomac River, this is the exact end of it. It doesn't go any further. Therefore, creatures that move from treetop to treetop end their distribution here. Alexandria obviously has defoliated, taken down the trees, so it's not a constant habitat. So something like flying squirrels that need to be able to volt from tree to tree, this is as far north as they can get.
In the marsh, a lot of the birds need a little privacy to breed. You can't have noisy things happen in their backyard all the time.
Ah, Caspian tern. Hear it? Making that. Yeah, now hear the little whiny thing? That's the baby Caspian tern. This bird was probably born up on the Great Lakes this year. There's a cormorant.
This is also a convergence area for migratory bird routes up and down the East Coast. It's uncanny how they invariably come to this area just south of our nation's capital.
They start coming in about a month ago. I think it's, as a matter of fact, I think I saw the first 6 or 7 fly in. And then they come in, and they come in quite thick all the way into the end of September. And then they just all leave. One day you look around and there's no white egrets anymore.
Two of the most important bird species that we can find in Dyke Marsh include the marsh wren and the least bittern. These are species that are very rare in the Washington, D.C. area. Historically, almost all of Washington, D.C. was a marsh, and it was drained and filled in, and those marshes are now gone. Historic photographs show acres and acres, as far as the eye can see, of wild rice and plants like American lotus. American lotus, again, can't be found anyplace else in the Washington, D.C. area now. But those marshes used to be filled with Sora rails and Virginia rails, and those bird species now are mostly found in the Washington, D.C. area, only in Dyke Marsh.
This collection has something over 600,000. Part of our collections include birds from Dyke Marsh, such as this Marsh Wren. These are cute little birds, and they sing like crazy.
We're approaching Marsh Wren Central of Dyke Marsh. I call it that because marsh wrens are a kind of colonial nester, if you will. They like to nest in clusters. Don't see any nests. And early observers back in the 1800s through the earlier part of the 20th century said this area had hundreds of singing marsh wrens. And I counted 31 singing males, 31 territories in 1998. So what happened? Well, likely explanation would be habitat loss. This area that we're in right now was all marsh until it was dredged for sand and gravel back in the 70s and 60s. So maybe this area was the traditional central colonial nesting area.
These small herons, all taken at Dyke Marsh, are the smallest herons in North America. Dyke Marsh is probably the best place in Virginia to find this species. This large critter is the osprey, sometimes known as the fishhawk. It's quite common at Dyke Marsh, but as little as 40 years ago, it, with a bald eagle, was on the way out from the effect of DDT on its eggs. Because they did such a good job of reducing the pesticide problem, these things are coming back.
Between the least bittern and the amount of osprey that are back, I mean, there's been nowhere near the amount of osprey for the last, 15 years ago, I would have seen. Now we have so many down here, it's amazing. I think we're going to need osprey condos to keep them all in.
The marsh here, in particular, is home to a fairly good representative of migratory ducks, waterfowl, particularly in the autumn when they come in and then remaining over winter and then leaving in the spring.
It's one of the best places in Northern Virginia to look at birds.
All these little small fish jumping now are baby shad hatchlings that are working their way down to the Chesapeake Bay.
These
guys are catching so many bass, it's amazing. I mean, the bass fishing was almost non-existent for several years, and within the last, I don't know, it's hard to say, 8 to 10 years or so, with the grass, with the hydrilla that came in, it helped all the other grasses, and it really helped the marsh and the birds. I mean, it brought huge amounts of ducks and everything back here, but along with all that came all the bass and all the crappie, the bluegill, and perch. So it's just a huge feeding frenzy, which makes everything work.
The fish come in here to this tidal marsh because this provides protection for spawning. It provides food for the adolescent stage that's a blue heron taking off in our background. During their adolescent stage, they grow here until they can get out into the Potomac and subsequently into the Chesapeake Bay. If it wasn't here, I don't know what would happen to the fish that populate the Chesapeake Bay. They rely upon this.
I went fishing yesterday, and out of me and this guy, that a hook and line, we caught 400 to 60 pounds of catfish. 2 people. Now that is hard to believe, but it's the honest truth.
This is our animals database. In it we have 390 species of animals documented from Dyke Marsh, and it hasn't yet incorporated all of the insect data that we expect to soon be receiving from Ed Barrows' work.
A lot of species we expected to find, we just don't find. They used to be here due to the fact that the soil here is all fill that's been carted in by dump trucks and barges and thrown here to make a barrier protecting the mainland from the Potomac River. It's not good soil to burrow in. Spotted salamanders, a burrowing animal we never found here, and an awful lot of other amphibians and snakes that should be here just didn't seem to be present. If the amphibians come in to breed, the reptiles come in to feed on them, and we get more turtles and snakes, and I think that's good. Some people don't.
Arthropods comprise the largest group of animals on the planet. They comprise the largest phylum, and they're doing all kinds of things that help support humans on Earth. They're pollinating plants, and a lot of our food depends on pollination. They recycle nutrients in ecosystems, and of course we harvest things from various habitats and ecosystems that enable us to survive so well on the planet. So they're major forces. There's a very famous scientist named E.O. Wilson, and he calls the arthropods the little things that run the planet. And without them, our planet would be very different. For instance, if pollination stopped, pollination by insects stopped, very soon, within weeks, there'd be starvation in parts of the world. You would not find as many arthropods in most parts of northern Virginia because a lot of it is now sprawl.
Look at there right on the edge of the marsh is a great big dragonfly. That's a wonderful thing because you know those things are called mosquito hawks, and they'll catch and eat mosquitoes as well as small insects. But here that creature alone has got its own little habitat, it's got its own little unique place where it lives.
A noctoid moth has a special eardrum on the side of its body. We were able to identify 92 species of larger noctoid moths.
Well, the population growth here has been enormous, and this was a neglected area at one time, but more and more people want to use it for the marina, for all kinds of purposes.
I grew up in this area, and the population has quadrupled and more. We've not added any more Dyke marshes, any more special places.
Controlling development and making sure we do it in ways that reduce the impact. I mean, and that's sort of an oxymoron. We talk about smart growth, but I think we have to very carefully figure out how to incorporate these natural systems in our development patterns and not just assume that they're an extra. They're not an extra at all. They're essential things.
Even golf courses today are being developed in a much more intelligent way than they were 30 years ago. 30 years ago, everything was grass as far as you could see from fairway to fairway. Now they're reducing the size of the landing areas. They're leaving native plants and landscape in between the fairways and in between the tees and the greens and the landing areas, and they're putting in birdhouses, and they're controlling their chemicals so that they run into either vegetative filters or into detention areas where they're then recycled, and not running off all the nutrients or pollutants or chemicals into the surrounding waterways. And even the PGA is doing that.
The streams that characterizes these areas normally flood every couple of years. And everything that grows around them depends on that flooding, on that kind of dynamic. Well, those streams now in the urban areas are not flooding every couple of years because they're being controlled not to flood like that. And also, as a result of that, they have incised. So they no longer have shallow banks, but quite deep cliffs almost. So what has happened is that the floodplains, which in a sense are connected to the streams, like the marshes are connected to the estuary, have changed dramatically.
You come down there after a thunderstorm and just watch the funk come rolling out of there between the trash bottles and whatever. It's amazing.
The whole river is under tremendous stress.
So many people want to put their houses right on the water's edge and build their commercial ventures on the water's edge. It's a wrong way to look at things. Now we're faced with the possibility of this big development called National Harbor right across from Dyke Marsh, where they're talking about, in addition to putting high rises in, talking about putting 2,500 houses. You know, what kind of an effect is that going to have on the river and the use of it?
National Harbor I view as, it's hard to say it was one of the worst things to come to this area, but I see it as a terrible misuse of the shoreline. So I see converting it into a big sprawling entertainment complex, hotels, whatever it is, rather than a park, which at one time everybody hoped it would become, is a terrible, terrible shame and a terrible loss.
Hurricane Isabel knocked a lot of these trees over. Last big hurricane that came through.
Just before Isabel, the grasses were in a down cycle, and then Hurricane Isabel came along and kind of wiped the grasses out. I mean, Hurricane Isabel took whatever, a massive piece off of the end of back over here and over behind the Marina. So, but a few more storms like that, who knows what it'll do.
The biggest problem is erosion. As the ships go up and down the river, regardless of speed limits that are imposed by the Coast Guard and local authorities, there's still a lot of erosion of the banks of the marsh itself.
There's definitely far more speedboats and motorboats and far more jet skis because they're just easy. There's no real rules. You just jump in and turn the key and go. Hope you don't hit anything.
If you stay on the Hall Road or go in other places that face the river, you will notice that very obviously in places the soil is being chipped away, if you will, by the movement of the water. Sandy Spencer found that to be the case when she was studying her Marsh Wrens out here. She noted that some of the territories from one year to the next disappeared because they were on the edge of the banks of the river.
So the erosion is huge. I mean, the island back over here where this other osprey lives is just lost hundreds and hundreds of trees. It won't be around very long if it keeps eroding this fast. So something has to be done.
Many big trees don't have their roots solid in dirt because of the rock, the cement, the concrete, the rebar, and windstorms knock down a tremendous number of big trees. And now the vines are covering everything.
Dyke Marsh Preserve is really challenged by alien invasive plants and other kinds of alien invasive creatures. These vines are not native, and these are the porcelain berries that came from Asia. There's also Asiatic bittersweet here, Japanese honeysuckle, and many other invasives. Perhaps about a third or so of the plants that are here are not native to the area.
Well, the relationship between the plants and the insects and the arthropods is crucial. So as you start to lose all these species, these plant species, it's important to know what it's doing to the arthropod fauna. And so I have been monitoring how arthropods, their populations and species diversity change when areas get invaded by alien plants.
Just over my shoulder you can see a stand of tall grass with fluffy plumes at the top of the stems. That's a plant called Phragmites australis, the common reed, and it's one of the invasive species that we have in the marsh and one of the things we've been working to control. We have some other invasive species in the marsh too, primarily purple loosestrife.
Let's say a hurricane comes through, Isabel hits Dyke Marsh. You end up disturbing all of the communities, all of the insect communities, all of the plant communities. And if you end up with monocultures like it's becoming, where sure the birds will eat the porcelain berries, but if there's only one species here, porcelain berry, a hurricane comes through and wipes out all of that porcelain berry, there's nothing left to replace it. There aren't many levels. Porcelain berry only comes out at one time of the year. If you lose all of the other plants, some of them may have been flowering earlier in the year, some of them flower later. They can support a larger diversity of animals. And so if you end up with this monoculture, it just creates a very unstable situation. If people had thought about it before they had planted them in their front lawns, we would not have a problem here at all. If the Park Service or concerned groups do not physically remove the alien plants and suppress them from now on, this park will disappear.
Dredging, nearly wrecked the marsh.
The biggest threat to Dyke Marsh now is its small size.
Unless we get the help of a lot of people, this will slide away.
If nothing is done to stop the marsh from sliding off into the pits that were created by the gravel operations here, we will lose the marsh permanently.
It kind of left, in effect, an unstable cliff. As the sediments were removed from around the marsh for sand and gravel, that is allowing some of the underlying sediments to kind of ooze out into that open area that would not have been there before.
Global warming, the gradual rise in sea level, which of course we're a tidal river, so anything that happens in the ocean or in the world is going to affect this marsh.
The biggest threat bay-wide to marsh is rising sea level, which is a consequence both of land around the Chesapeake sinking and global warming causing the sea level to rise faster. We literally stand to lose thousands and probably tens of thousands of acres of marsh in the next half century to sea level rise. It's coming up faster than it ever has, and it's turning high marsh to low marsh to open water.
As you can see behind me is a forested land with a George Washington Memorial Parkway and also the houses. So Dyke Marsh in this area really has no way to migrate anywhere towards the back as it can still move around. The sea level does rise.
It was important to have systematic inventories made of the marsh to show what was unique about it, that it wasn't just a vacant piece of real estate. Right. It's a freshwater tidal marsh. That's a distinctive quality here.
Every kind of organism has something interesting about it. And if we knew about how a particular organism lives, how it's made up in terms of its biochemistry, its organelles and things like that, we would be making major breakthroughs into science, because no one organism is understood very well.
Tidal marshes are so very diverse and so productive
that there's so many species out there that it's really hard to tell for sure what patterns really might exist. Because it's tidal, certain areas are more flooded than others at different times of the day. I think that this might have an effect on what vegetation is able to grow in various locations in the marsh. If it's flooded longer, it needs to be more tolerant of flooding.
We looked at vegetation structure. We looked at what kinds of seeds might be coming in from the river. We took some soil cores right out of the marsh and then germinated them here in the Appalachian Lab greenhouse. What we're trying to do here is figure out whether there are any really bad invasive species that could be potentially be coming into this marsh, or whether most of these are native species that are probably in the marsh already. What we're actually finding is, for example, for the vegetation structure, is that from year to year, it's not the same vegetation in one single plot.
I'm looking at what vegetation exists, where it is, and how close it is to the channels that feed the marsh, and how high the elevation is where the vegetation is persisting.
So am I seeing this right, that once we understand this relationship between elevation and vegetation, we can now project what might happen to Dyke Marsh or any kind of marshes that are similar to Dyke Marsh in the context of sea level rise.
We want to know what is the rate of sediment deposition that's going on, what is the rate of subsidence, which would be the settling of the sediments of the marsh.
The restoration project is absolutely necessary, or in 20 years there'll be no marsh, and it'll be a great loss to everybody.
Congress passed legislation to preserve Dyke Marsh. It is the intent of the National Park Service to restore portions of Dyke Marsh that were dredged many, many years ago by building up the sediment and other natural elements of a freshwater tidal marsh.
If the National Park Service decides to replace some of the lost areas with new created marsh areas, and if they are successful in revegetating these areas with a diverse native vegetation, then Dyke Marsh may become a very important and vital kidney of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, enhancing the water quality in the Potomac River, which will have tremendous consequences on the health of the Chesapeake Bay itself.
We felt it was incumbent on us to keep it as natural as possible.
I want to be sure that nothing I do as a developer negatively affects Dyke Marsh. And matter of fact, I want it to be here for my children and grandchildren to be able to come birding here. And I, as a matter of fact, would like to do things in the surrounding areas if I were to develop right by here that would enhance the habitat here rather than detract from the habitat. And I hope everybody else feels the same way.
Well, the marshes are really threatened very much in the urban areas. Take a lesson from the existing marshes and try to reconstruct some of these marshes through the urban areas so that they can function in retaining material that run off from the urban, suburban developments, which are becoming more and more a part of our landscape.
In our urban areas, marshes are under assault from runoff as we pave upstream. They just get gushers of water coming down. So marshes are a long way from being protected. We need to completely rethink development of the upland edges around the bay and its rivers, because in my opinion, we're going to lose a lot of our present marsh. We need to make sure they've got room over the long term to expand inland as sea level rises. If we develop and pave right up to the edge of the existing marsh, we cut off that option.
With your friends for this one, that's all right.
Yes!
It's quick.
Well, it's been used by school children of all ages up through postgraduate. It's an outdoor laboratory.
With funding from the National Park Service and from NOAA,
We have teachers partnering with our researchers at Dyke Marsh, helping teachers and ultimately their students make a connection and really inspire them to be a part of their environment, to be active participants.
Several years ago, working with other members of the congressional delegation, we got the funding to put through a first-class bike path. It goes all the way from the Memorial Bridge to Mount Vernon.
If people would respect Dyke Marsh, it's one of the prettiest places that's ever on earth. I used to get in my boat and go down in the morning just to sit out in the river and watch the birds and the ducks and the geese come in there. That was their playing ground, just like this right here. And there's a seagull looking for his food, but he knows where to find it in Dyke Marsh.
One of my favorite places in the world. We can see what the loss of wetlands around Louisiana meant to the people who lived in New Orleans. This is very important to preserve for the protection of people who live in Northern Virginia, because this wetlands protects development inland. It's a very important legacy that we need to leave to our children and to their children, to understand how the ecological system works. It's owned by the National Park Service, which means that all of us own it. It's yours, it's ours, it's our children's. Let's protect and preserve it.
The latest proposal was to run that new Wilson Bridge right across here. And fortunately, we deterred them. We and the golf course and a few other people.
Well, you and I went to I don't know how many meetings on that thing, but we were pleased when the Southern Alignment, they called it.
Yep.
They finally went back to the idea of using the...
That was a partial victory for us.
Partial victory, right.
Not a total one. Every Sunday morning we have a bird walk, and people enjoy noticing the change of seasons, and, as well as the birds that they're here to see.
Right.
We do the Christmas bird count. We have a spring breeding count. We have pretty good records going back 20, 30 years.
We've actually seen least bitterns around here too.
Wow, what a beautiful bird.
When I was a young kid, I'll say, my father, he had a 32-foot tin boat, and he used to set his net from Jones's Point, would come straight down river for 1,500 feet. And the creek that he fished was called Little Hunting Creek. He used to take that up and have 1,000 to 1,500 foot of rope so he could make his swing. And after he got that, he had a 1931 Ford pickup truck sitting on shore, jacked up to when he put it in gear, it would pull the rope because the wheel would be turning. And then the men would start pulling the net in. And then that's when you catch 15 to 18,000 pounds of catfish or carp. That's the way we made our living. And believe me, it was a rough life.
You catch turtles the size of small children, 60, 70 pounds of turtles. Now they're all coming back. They're coming back, they're about the size of humans' heads and getting a little bigger, so big turtles are coming back.
These are male red-winged blackbirds. They're one of the most abundant birds in the marsh at Dyke Marsh. They're worth the allowance just for the cheer they give you in the spring when they return. Set up on a cattail and start singing.
The little shrew that occurs here is the biggest shrew there is around here, the short-tailed shrew, Blarina brevicauda. This species is the only known poisonous mammal. It has saliva that runs through grooves in its teeth and gets into the wound, and it's a neurotoxic saliva which causes paralysis. So when they attack an animal bigger than them, the poison helps subdue the restraining of the animal, and they get to feed on it.
Mac, come over here a minute. Bring your fishing rod. I just saw Mac. He was out here fishing. He's a legend. Good morning to you.
Good morning, sir.
Didn't mean to draft you in on this thing, but you spent a lot of time in this estuary. You've caught them all here, haven't you?
I've caught a lot of fish.
Do you enjoy, as everybody else, the birds?
Yes, there are many eagles here, especially this time of year.
And the wildlife?
Lots of wildlife.
Foxes, beavers are always building in there, correct?
Occasionally an otter.
An otter?
True. Yes.
Good. Well, thank you a lot. You go back to your fishing.
Yes,
Good
sir.
luck to you.
Good luck to you. Thank you.
The government needs to be buying these special places. The government needs to continue to add them as populations grow, because they're important to the education and the soul of people to be able to walk around places like Dyke Marsh.
Enforce the laws. Wetlands laws, tidal wetlands laws are pretty good. They're not always followed rigorously. We sometimes allow things that don't constitute direct filling or dredging of the wetlands, but we change the drainage patterns upstream, and that can kill a marsh just as surely as filling it.
In the reconstruction or the construction of marshes, they're not going to maybe function immediately. It may take a while.